In October 1944, in a small English village most Americans have never heard of, a black U.S. Army soldier walked into a pub that had been standing since before the American Revolution. Within minutes, his presence would provoke a confrontation so volatile that it threatened to erupt into violence between Allied forces, yet no shots would be fired, no official report would be written, and no medals would ever be awarded. Instead, the moment would be quietly buried, remembered only in fragments of letters, diaries, and the memory of one man who had been trained since childhood to survive by knowing when to disappear. The soldier had crossed an ocean to fight for freedom, but the danger waiting for him that night did not come from Nazi bombs or enemy soldiers. It came from the same rules that had governed his life since Alabama, rules that followed him into uniform, onto ships, and across continents. What he did not know, as he lifted his glass in that dimly lit pub, was that 3 white American soldiers were about to test whether those rules still applied on foreign soil. What they did not expect was resistance, because standing behind the bar was an English pub owner who had survived rationing, air raids, and years of war, and who refused, in that moment, to import American segregation into his establishment. When the white soldiers demanded the black man be removed, the landlord chose confrontation over compliance, fairness over fear, and principle over profit. In doing so, he drew a line that exposed an uncomfortable truth. Racism was not universal, and it was not required. This was not an act of heroism meant for history books. It was an ordinary decision made in an extraordinary moment, and that is why it mattered. Because when one man refused to look away, the entire system of silent obedience cracked, just enough to reveal what the world might have been if different choices had been made. And once that crack appeared, it could never be unseen. By the time the United States entered World War II in December 1941, segregation was already woven into the daily life of black Americans with a precision so complete it rarely needed explanation. In the Deep South, where this soldier was raised, racial rules were enforced not only by law, but by memory, gesture, and fear passed carefully from one generation to the next. By childhood, he understood which streets to cross, which doors never opened for him, and which questions could get him hurt. These lessons were not written down, but they were absolute. Survival depended on learning them early and never forgetting them. When the Army began recruiting black men after Pearl Harbor, it did so reluctantly and separately. Training camps in Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolinas mirrored the Jim Crow world outside their gates. Black recruits were assigned inferior housing, limited roles, and officers who spoke of order and discipline as justification for separation. Combat positions were rare. Most black units were funneled into labor battalions, engineers, drivers, porters, essential to the war effort but denied its glory. In April 1944, as preparations for the invasion of Normandy accelerated, thousands of these segregated units were shipped to Britain. The official reason was logistics. The unspoken reality was distance, far from home. Racial conflict could be controlled, contained, and hidden. England, battered by years of bombing and rationing, became an unlikely stage for America's contradictions. Villages in Wiltshire, Somerset, and Devon filled with foreign uniforms, unfamiliar accents, and the constant movement of war. Nissen huts rose beside hedgerows that had stood for centuries. Pubs glowed at night despite blackouts, offering warmth, beer, and momentary escape. American military authorities issued quiet guidance to prevent friction with locals, encouraging racial separation without making it official. But Britain had not grown up under Jim Crow. Its class divisions were sharp, its prejudices real, yet race did not function as an automatic barrier to public space. Black American soldiers entered shops, buses, and pubs expecting hostility, and instead found something far more unsettling: indifference, courtesy, choice. It was into this uneasy, temporary overlap of 2 very different worlds that one black soldier stepped, unaware that a single evening would force everyone involved to choose which rules truly mattered. The black American soldier at the center of this story was born in 1924. In rural Alabama, the grandson of sharecroppers and the son of a sawmill laborer whose hands carried the permanent marks of survival work. His name does not appear in official army histories, but fragments of his life remain in letters sent home and a diary kept sporadically during the war. He learned early that silence could be protection and obedience could be armor. By the time he enlisted in 1942, he had mastered the art of restraint, measured speech, lowered eyes, and the ability to read danger before it announced itself. Assigned to the 1696th Engineer Combat Battalion, his role was construction and logistics, not combat. Yet the weight he carried was constant and internal. The pub owner was Arthur Bennett, born in 1891, a veteran of the First World War and the son of a Wiltshire stonemason. By 1944, he had run the Swan and Crown for nearly a decade. He had buried friends after the Somme, survived Zeppelin raids, and watched his village empty of young men twice in one lifetime. He was not an activist, not political by reputation, and not inclined toward grand speeches. He believed in order, fairness, and the unspoken code of the pub. Pay your way, keep the peace, and treat others as you wish to be treated. The white American soldiers who would later enter the pub were younger, raised in the segregated South and Midwest, carrying authority without reflection. To them, the uniform reinforced a hierarchy they had never questioned. England, in their minds, was merely another territory where American rules should apply. None of these men woke up that morning expecting history. Each believed he understood his place in the world. What none of them realized was that within hours, those assumptions would collide inside a single room, forcing a choice that would reveal character more clearly than any battlefield ever could. The evening began without ceremony. Late October rain slicked the cobblestones of the Wiltshire village, and the Swan and Crown glowed amber against the dark, its windows fogged with breath and smoke. Inside, conversation moved in low currents, punctuated by the clink of glass and the muted crackle of a coal fire. The black soldier entered alone, his uniform damp at the cuffs, his movements careful but unafraid. He ordered a mild ale and took a place near the wall, where he could see the door without drawing attention. Nothing happened, and that absence of threat felt unfamiliar. 20 minutes later, the door opened again. 3 white American soldiers stepped inside, loud before they were fully through the frame, their laughter cutting across the room. They brought with them the smell of whiskey and certainty. Their eyes adjusted to the light, and one of them noticed the soldier by the wall. A glance became a grin. The grin became a whisper. The whisper became a decision. What the room did not know was that this moment had already happened hundreds of times. Before, in a different country, with a different ending, the black soldier lowered his gaze, keeping his hands visible, his body still. He had learned the choreography well, but England had disrupted the rhythm. No signs, no warnings, no exits marked for him alone. The white soldier approached, boots loud on the wooden floor. His voice was casual, almost amused, as he questioned why the black man was there. The answer was simple: he had paid. That was not acceptable. The tone shifted. The words sharpened. A hand reached for fabric. What they did not consider was the man behind the bar. Arthur Bennett had been watching from the moment the Americans entered, recognizing the pattern from earlier incidents whispered through the village. He saw the grip tighten. He heard the room fall silent. He understood exactly what was about to happen. And in that instant, before the first blow could land, the night balanced on a choice, one that would determine whether this pub would become just another place. A man had been forced to leave, or something far more dangerous to the order everyone assumed was fixed. The truth revealed itself not in violence, but in refusal. When Arthur Bennett spoke, his voice cut through the room, with a calm that carried more authority than shouting ever could. He did not appeal to law, nor to patriotism, nor to fear of consequence. He stated a principle. The black soldier was a customer. He had paid for his drink. That was enough. In that moment, the hidden machinery of segregation, so familiar to the Americans, failed to function. There was no sheriff to summon, no officer to defer to, no silent crowd willing to look away. What the white soldiers had assumed was universal was not. The racial order they carried with them depended entirely on collective obedience. Remove that obedience, and the system collapsed into nothing more than a demand backed by habit. England did not share the habit. The pub did not recognize the rule, and the landlord refused to perform the expected role of enforcer. What made this moment dangerous was not moral disagreement, but exposure. British civilians were watching. They were seeing American soldiers not as liberators, but as aggressors attempting to impose foreign customs through intimidation. The U.S. Army understood this risk well. Internal memoranda from 1943 and 1944 warned commanders that racial incidents in Britain could undermine morale, strain alliances, and damage America's image abroad. Officially, segregation was described as regrettable but necessary. Unofficially, it was to be kept invisible. But invisibility failed that night. The black soldier remained seated. The white soldier released his grip. No one moved. In that silence, something irreversible occurred. A hierarchy that had governed one man's entire life was openly challenged and found unsupported, not by protest or ideology, but by ordinary refusal. The revelation was simple and devastating. Segregation survived only where it was enforced. Where people declined to participate, it held no power. And once that truth appeared, even briefly, it could not be erased, only avoided, denied, and buried in places where the wrong people might never see it. The aftermath was quiet by design. No military police arrived. No reports were filed. No charges were brought. By morning, the incident had already begun to dissolve into rumor, passed between soldiers in lowered voices and stripped of names and specifics. This silence was not accidental. The U.S. Army had long understood that acknowledging racial conflict overseas risked exposing a contradiction too large to manage, fighting fascism abroad while enforcing segregation within its own ranks. In the weeks that followed, subtle changes appeared. White American soldiers stopped frequenting the Swan and Crown. Some said they had been warned by officers to avoid the establishment. Others claimed it was their own choice. The result was the same. The pub quietly became a space where black soldiers could sit without incident. Though no sign marked the difference, what existed there depended entirely on memory and mutual understanding. For the black soldier, the consequences were internal and lasting. He returned to segregated barracks, to separate facilities and controlled passes, yet something fundamental had shifted. He had not been removed. He had not been forced to comply. For once, the outcome had not been determined by fear. That knowledge stayed with him, altering how he understood himself and the limits imposed upon him. Arthur Bennett faced no official punishment, but the risk he had taken was real. His pub depended on American business during wartime shortages. One complaint could have resulted in loss of supply, pressure from local authorities, or closure. He accepted that risk without comment and never spoke publicly about the incident. In the village, his action was noted, not celebrated. It became part of his reputation. Fair, stubborn, unwilling to be told how to treat people in his own house. Beyond the village, nothing changed. Segregation remained policy. Black units continued to serve without recognition. Yet this moment, contained and unrecorded, created something the system could not fully undo, a memory of resistance that required no permission and left no paper trail, only a quiet understanding that obedience was not inevitable, even when the world insisted otherwise. History often records its turning points through speeches, battles, and laws. But the truth is that many of the most consequential moments occur far from cameras and crowds. In the autumn of 1944, while the world's attention was fixed on beaches in France and maps in war rooms, a quieter confrontation unfolded inside a village pub in Wiltshire. No territory changed hands that night, yet something just as significant was exposed. The idea that dignity depended on permission was challenged and found lacking. The black American soldier returned home to a nation still committed to segregation, still demanding silence and compliance. England did not save him from that reality. The pub owner did not dismantle the system, but the moment they shared proved that racism was not an unbreakable law of nature. It required agreement. It required enforcement. And when ordinary people refused to participate, its power weakened even if only briefly. That is the danger of small acts of courage. They offer evidence. They give the oppressed a reference point, a memory that cannot be erased, even when circumstances remain unchanged. Long before court rulings and marches forced America to confront itself, men like this soldier had already seen what equality looked like in practice. Not perfect, not permanent, but real. The Swan and Crown still stands today, its beams darkened by centuries of smoke and history. Visitors pass through without knowing what once occurred inside its walls. Yet that ignorance does not diminish the event. It underscores it, because the most threatening truths are not always shouted. They are lived, briefly, and then carried forward by those who experience them. Now the question turns to you. How many moments like this were lost because no one wrote them down? How many acts of quiet resistance shaped lives without ever entering textbooks? And if you had been in that room, would you have spoken or stayed silent? Share your thoughts in the comments. What state are you watching from? And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe for more buried histories the world nearly forgot.